Britain's jails are overflowing. More than 87,000 prisoners are currently incarcerated within their walls. For almost all of these, the aim is rehabilitation and release. But a tiny number are deemed so dangerous and depraved that they will never be freed. This extraordinary group of 45 men and 1 woman includes serial killers, torturers, hired assassins, and psychotic sadists. In some cases, the faces are familiar. Others are better known by the nicknames given to them by the press. But many of them you will never have heard of. This series will shine a light on the dark world of some of these killers. The subject of tonight's programme is a vicious double killer.
He will offend against anybody for anything at any time.
Who attacked men, women and juveniles throughout his life of violent crime.
This was a man who looked for vulnerability in others, and he didn't distinguish between victims.
He was a violent man and was capable of inflicting these offences on males and females.
It's also a story of an incredibly complex murder investigation and a family ripped apart.
I wanted the police to find the killer, and then I could start living my life again.
I believe that Jackson was evil.
October the 3rd, 2006, Norwich. 73-year-old sex offender Gordon Boone attends a meeting with his probation officer. It would be one of the last things he would ever do.
That was the last time Gordon Boone was seen. He went to his probation office at 10 a.m. And was never seen again alive.
The following day, Saturday the 4th of October, Boone had arranged to meet one of his sons in a pub in Norwich. But he failed to show up.
He tried to contact his father on his mobile phone to say exactly what time are we going to meet and where are we going to meet. And he couldn't get a hold of him. This was unusual. They'd always met before, they'd always turned up, and he was always contactable on his mobile phone.
My brother phoned my mum up and said that he couldn't locate my father because they used to always meet up and go for a drink. And once my mum got off the phone, she phoned the police.
Concerned, Boone's son went round to his father's home.
He looked through the letterbox and saw that the TV was on and thought this was a little bit bizarre. Tried to repeatedly call for his dad on the mobile phone. No answer.
The police responded quickly and broke into the flat.
On going into the flat, it was quite apparent that things weren't quite right. The lights were on. There was a half-drunk cup of coffee on the coffee table. The newspaper was there for the previous day. Gordon would normally go out and buy his paper first thing in the morning. So those things that were met by police officers on going in suggested the fact that Gordon wasn't there was something not quite right.
Norfolk police began a missing persons inquiry and began visiting Boone's friends and acquaintances. One of the people they called on was Royston Jackson, who had met Boone at a bail hostel in Norwich after both men had been released from prison.
Gordon Boone, Royston Jackson resided at the hostel for a period of about a year together. They were in each other's company constantly.
It was an unlikely friendship.
Gordon was in his 70s. He had suffered a stroke. He did have a heart condition with which he was receiving medication for. So yeah, he wasn't in the best of health. Royston obviously at the time was in his 40s, so there is a big age gap. What their common interests were, I wouldn't like to say exactly, but they did form a friendship.
After a year in the hostel, both men found their own private accommodation in Norwich, but they remained friends.
There was still this association or this friendship carried on. They would see each other from time to time.
So when Gordon Boone disappeared, Royston Jackson was an obvious person for the police to speak to. But his reaction immediately raised suspicions.
He initially said I hadn't seen him for 2 to 3 weeks, and then corrected it and said I hadn't seen him for 4 weeks.
Jackson's behaviour became increasingly bizarre.
He let the police officer know that he was a convicted murderer and that he'd served a sentence for murder in prison, that he was employed as a turkey catcher, and was quite keen for the police officer to actually be aware that he'd got some scratches on his arms that he'd received as a result of trying to catch turkeys. You may think it's a bit strange that he would want to volunteer that piece of information to a police officer who's simply asking him when's the last time, or have you heard from your friend Gordon Boone.
24 hours later, there was a sinister development.
About 12:45 p.m, we get a call into the control room from a member of the public who said that they'd found the body of a male in an isolated location about 5 or 6 miles outside of Norwich. We're now driving to the location where the body was found, which is approximately 30 minutes from Norwich city centre. This whole area is dotted with turkey production, and we're just about now to turn into Rabbit Lane. And this is where the body was found, just off the side of the road. It was an isolated location, somewhere that people would fly tip. A member of the public was looking for something that might be of value to take away from this dumping site. Their attention was drawn to some scrap that had been dumped by the side of the road just a little bit further along down the track. They moved one of the fence panels slightly. And underneath the fence panels there was visible the body of a partially clothed elderly male. The body was laying in the fetal position. No footwear, no lower clothing, trousers, jacket or anything like that. It was just simply elderly male in underwear. The area was sealed off as a crime scene, and a meticulous search and sort of a search for forensic evidence would then be underway, and we were here for 2 or 3 days.
The story quickly hit the local news.
The police forensic team searching for clues that will lead them to the identity of the man discovered yesterday lunchtime and how he met his death.
Having reported their 73-year-old father missing 2 days earlier, Katie Utting and her family were on edge.
My mum and I were watching television and it came up that a body had been found in some woodlands. First of all, we thought, well, perhaps it could be my dad, but with the age they gave, we never dreamed that it was my father.
Detectives believe the man's aged between 40 and 50. A post-mortem will be carried out tomorrow, by which time the police hope to have established who the man was and whether they're dealing with a murder inquiry.
However, it didn't take long for police to identify the body. The first place they checked was the missing persons file.
We took fingerprints from the body, which would be a normal thing we were to do. Those fingerprints were checked quite quickly against those fingerprints held off Gordon Boone because of his offending history. Within a few hours of finding that body at this location, we had established that it was the body of Gordon Boone.
The police now had the difficult task of informing Gordon Boone's family that he had been murdered.
2 plainclothes coppers came to the door. They come in and we sat down and they said, we have found the body of your father.
It was the beginning of an extraordinarily complex murder inquiry.
It wasn't clear at the time how he'd met his death. Although there was a lot of blood, we couldn't identify immediately what the cause of death was.
When that was looked more closely, it would appear that that blood had actually been from a seepage of blood from the nose and orifices that were on the body, and weren't actually blood that was actually as cause of any kind of serious or major wound. It is quite normal for blood to seep after death if a body's laid in a position at some stage. There was some bruising and other features that were found around the head and other marks that were found on the body, but none of these were actually consistent with his death, and the cause of death was given as strangulation.
We could not be certain what was used to strangle him. He had some marks around his neck which were unusual. It could have been some sort of tourniquet. It could have been hands and tourniquet. We weren't absolutely certain.
The complexities of the murder were made all the more difficult because of the horrific nature of the victim's crimes.
There are an awful lot of people who may have wanted to see him suffer or die.
Norfolk police had found the body of 73-year-old Gordon Boone in a hedgerow on the outskirts of Norwich. But their efforts to find the killer would be hampered by the fact that Boone was a convicted paedophile and his crimes were particularly despicable.
Gordon Boone had been convicted of paedophilia against his daughter.
Katie Utting was Gordon Boone's daughter.
I was sexually abused by him from the age of 8 right through until I left school. He went all the way. That's the easiest way of putting it. He went all the way. He used to say if you tell anybody, you know, he'd do something, so I never ever said anything until I was 16 when I told my mum.
Forensic psychologist Kerry Daines studies killers and sex offenders and what motivates them to commit their crimes.
Gordon Boone is a man who's clearly prepared to go to great lengths to achieve his own gratification. He hasn't got normal sexual boundaries or morals. He's got a perverse interest in children, including those in his own family.
Katie finally went to the police, and Boone was arrested.
He was sentenced to 6 years in prison in 2001 and was released at the end of 2005, having served 4 years of that prison sentence.
I did go to see him because I basically went to see him because I was hoping he'd tell me why or even say sorry, but he never ever did.
Despite what had happened to her, the arrival of the police to inform her about her father's death came as a shock to Katie.
I got a bit upset, that's only natural, you know. Even everything that I went through and he done, I still loved him in my own way. Perhaps people won't understand it, but it's true. With all what my dad did, he didn't deserve to die in the way he died. I wanted the police to find the killer, and then I could close the case on my dad so that I could start living my life again.
The daughter that Boone had abused may have wanted his killer brought to justice, but there weren't too many others who felt the same.
These sort of cases are very challenging. The victim was a paedophile, recently convicted, recently released from prison, and we were going to have a very difficult time in encouraging the public to come forward to assist us with the investigation.
As a society, I think that we like to make very clear distinctions between our victims and our offenders, the good guys and the bad guys. We like to think of our victims as innocent and blameless. Now, clearly Gordon Boone doesn't fit the profile of an archetypal victim, and this made this case very difficult to investigate.
In violent crimes such as murders, sometimes the victim has had a tainted past, but the fact that the victim may have crossed the line and been involved in criminal behaviour doesn't change the way we approach it, and it was our job to find who was responsible for murdering him and obviously bring that person to justice.
The national press, however, did little to help the investigation.
The tabloid press were engaged in printing stories about the murder, almost praising the fact that this individual was no longer with us, which made life even more difficult for us.
Journalist Ben Kendall covered the story for the local paper.
Once Gordon Boone's history became more apparent, I think the coverage it got initially on a national level was quite unsympathetic. It was, very much focusing on his history and his offences. You were getting, pedo killed type headlines. Locally, we did refer to the fact that he was a sex offender in headlines. It was a fact that couldn't be ignored, but perhaps in more sympathetic language. There was no getting away from the fact that this was a sex offender that had been killed and was not going to be getting the same kind of sympathy you would if it was a more routine murder inquiry.
With an apathetic public and a negative press to contend with, the investigation began.
I had a team of people looking at what we call victimology. Who did the victim know? Who would have had any sort of vendetta against this individual and why? And of course, because he was a paedophile, there are an awful lot of people who may have wanted to see him suffer or die.
Gordon Boone's immediate family were the first to be checked.
I had to obviously eliminate all of us, so we had to produce things to say that we were nowhere near where he was supposed to have been killed, but we were eliminated from the inquiry.
However, one name quickly emerged.
Within 48 hours, we had identified Royston Jackson as an associate who had been convicted of a very similar but very different murder. Alarm bells began to ring, and I identified him as, in my words, the number one suspect at that time.
17 years earlier, in Dagenham, Essex, Royston Jackson had taken the life of a teenage boy in one of the most violent murders imaginable.
This is the spot where Stephen Raven was murdered. Stephen's body was found here in the middle of the road. There were horrendous injuries to the body and he was laying in a large pool of blood. Stephen had sustained severe head injuries caused by a blunt instrument, a metal bar or wheel brace, something like that. He had been strangled and also had been driven over by a vehicle and dragged a number of feet and left here to die.
Stephen Raven was just 16 years old. His killer was 21-year-old Royston Jackson.
Jackson outwardly had the persona of just a normal person. He worked in the curtain shop as a cutter, albeit he was known to have a violent temper and threaten people.
Stephen Raven worked in the warehouse of the curtain business, and Jackson was known to bully him, and worse.
Jackson had threatened to kill Stephen on a previous occasion.
On the night of his murder, Stephen had attended a function at a social club.
Also attending was Royston Jackson. The last time that Stephen was seen alive, he was seen leaving that hall just after 11 p.m. and Jackson was seen leaving shortly afterwards. The next thing we knew, Stephen's body was found here.
Jackson had driven Stephen to a remote lay-by on the approach to a cemetery in a rural area of Dagenham and subjected him to a merciless attack.
This was a particularly brutal and terrible murder. To leave a victim in this secluded place to die is inconceivable.
Stephen Raven was subjected to horrific injuries. And for some killers, it's not enough just to kill. They have to act out their emotions and their fantasies in ways that go way above and beyond just death-producing injuries. And that certainly seems to be the case for Jackson. And I think that the violence had some sort of emotional significance.
The murder scene was gruesome, but it was also puzzling.
Stephen's clothing was dishevelled, his underpants had been interfered with and his shoes were missing. We never recovered those, despite a media appeal.
Jackson had already been convicted of theft and arson, so he was known to the police, who arrested him as their main suspect.
Jackson denied any knowledge whatsoever of the murder. He gave an alibi that he was at a party close by. He wasn't at that party, he'd never been there.
Because Stephen had been run over by a vehicle, Jackson's car was of great interest to the police. But Jackson may have been expecting a visit.
That car, the Ford Sierra that he had, was seized and examined, both for blood, of which no blood was found on the outside or underneath the vehicle, and also for a fingerprint examination. And amazingly, for a vehicle that Jackson had previously used as a minicab, there was only one fingerprint found inside the vehicle. So I do believe that he was forensically aware.
Angela Gallup is a forensic scientist. It's her job to examine contact trace material associated with crimes.
When a victim is run over by a car, there are lots of possibilities for forensic traces to be transferred. It would be extraordinarily difficult to remove all traces of them from the car. And so to this extent, it seems that Royston Jackson would have worked very hard to clean that car up.
But there was some crucial evidence that couldn't be washed or wiped away.
There were some tyre marks across Stephen's trousers. Those marks matched the tread pattern of Jackson's tyres.
There was enough evidence to charge Jackson, and he stood trial at the Old Bailey.
He was convicted by the jury of murder, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment.
For 16-year-old Stephen Raven, there was finally an element of justice.
Jackson was an extremely dangerous individual. Outwardly, a normal person. Inwardly, a very, very dangerous man.
Jackson spent 16 years in prison. Whilst inside, his family moved to Norfolk. So Jackson headed here on his release. He was placed in a bail hostel in Norwich, and it is here he met Gordon Boone. And now Norfolk police were noticing some chilling similarities between the murders of Boone and Stephen Raven.
Both locations were isolated. Gordon Boone's body had been found in a state of undress. Stephen Raven's body had been found with clothing dishevelled, underwear worn the wrong way, shirt off. So there were some signs of clothing interference, shall we say. There were elements of strangulation involved in the death of Stephen Raven, albeit his death was predominantly due to being hit around the head with a blunt, heavy instrument. Gordon Boone's was strangulation.
Even 17 years apart, these two murders are strikingly similar. And it's very typical for offenders to use the same methods during the commission of their offences. Both Gordon and Stephen had had the lower parts of their clothing removed. So the obvious conclusion is that maybe there was some sort of sexual element to these crimes. It's possible that Jackson found the infliction of pain to actually be very erotic.
With Jackson now the main suspect, the search for evidence that would incriminate him began in earnest.
One of the earliest things that we did in inquiry was to check mobile phone records.
There was an immediate breakthrough.
Gordon Boone had been contacted by Jackson on Friday the 3rd of October. So we had immediately identified contact on the last day that Gordon Boone was seen alive.
Jackson had told the police he hadn't seen or heard from Gordon Boone for a month. He was clearly lying. Cracks were already appearing in Jackson's alibi. The police then turned to the city's CCTV cameras in an attempt to shed some light on Jackson's movements prior to the murder.
We had some CCTV footage that showed Royston on the Friday the 3rd at his cash point drawing out some money at around about 5:30 in the morning. And also he was there later on, actually in the bank when it was opened. It just showed that Royston Jackson was in Norwich, and obviously this was on the Friday.
There was another important sighting, this time of the victim.
We established that Gordon Boone had gone to see his probation officer for a pre-arranged appointment around about 10 a.m. on Friday the 3rd of October, and we have CCTV footage of him visiting the probation hostel, meeting with his probation officer and leaving the hostel at just after 10 o'clock.
Clearly visible in the footage is a black bag that Boone always carried with him when he went out. When police had entered his flat following his disappearance, the black hold-all was still sitting beside the armchair, suggesting he hadn't intended to go far. Police had now established that Jackson was in the area at the time of the murder and that he had made contact with Gordon Boone just prior to his disappearance. And now another surveillance camera in the city was about to provide evidence that would be even more crucial.
We knew at the time that Royston Jackson was using a Ford Galaxy motor vehicle, and interestingly enough, on the Friday we found a similar vehicle driving along the Dereham Road in the general direction of where Gordon Boone lived, and this was about 9:30 in the evening, which again fitted in with the mobile telephone calls that we were aware of.
2 telephone calls in from Jackson to Boone. One was of a few minutes and the second one was a very brief call, almost as if I'm outside, come and meet me, was in my mind.
20 minutes later, the same camera picked up Jackson's car travelling in the opposite direction.
This was a Ford Galaxy, looks like it was identical to the one that we'd seen at 9:30, travelling in the general direction of Royston Jackson's home address.
Then police made a stunning discovery when they blew up the picture.
We identified what we considered to be a passenger in the vehicle.
I believe the passenger in that vehicle was Gordon Boone.
The next events in the case were quite remarkable, because as the police tried to snare the killer, yet another victim would come to light, and this time the victim was female.
She said in her statement she thought she was going to die.
A CCTV camera had picked up Royston Jackson's Ford Galaxy car driving in and out of Norwich city centre 20 minutes apart. In the second sighting, Jackson appeared to have a passenger in the car. The police believed that Jackson was driving into Norwich, picking up 73-year-old Gordon Boone at his home, then driving back out of the city. But they needed to test their theory.
This is the Dereham Road into Norwich city centre. This is the route that Royston Jackson drove down in his Ford Galaxy on the Friday night, the 3rd of October, en route to Gordon Boone's address and the location where the CCTV footage was captured of the Ford Galaxy.
Police timed the route, and sure enough,
Royston Jackson had enough time to get to Gordon Boone's address at Hellgate Court, pick him up and then drive the return journey back along the same Dereham Road where he was captured on CCTV on the opposite side of the road.
If Gordon Boone was in Jackson's car, as police suspected, he may well have been on the way to Jackson's home, although this was never proven.
All we could say is obviously the route that Royston Jackson would be taking in his Ford Galaxy, he would be driving directly towards his home address.
The second CCTV sighting of the Galaxy was at 9:50 p.m. on the Friday night. Yet more cameras would capture Jackson in the early hours of Saturday morning, and this time he was definitely alone.
We obtained some footage that showed that just after 1 a.m. Royston Jackson was seen driving onto the forecourt in the Ford Galaxy, entering the store and making a purchase from the counter and then leaving. About 4 hours later, Royston Jackson is again coming onto the forecourt. Again he comes into the store, again he makes a purchase and then he leaves. So those two sightings showed that Royston Jackson was up and about, it would appear, throughout the night and the early hours of Saturday morning.
By this time, Gordon Boone may well have lost his life.
My view at the time was this is when the body had been deposited in the location. This was him going out and this was him coming back after depositing the body.
The decision was taken to arrest Royston Jackson, but there was a hitch.
On the 9th of October, we sent officers to try and arrest him.
Unfortunately, he got wind of it somehow and he fled to Essex.
He then spent some time down in Essex, in the area where he was living, staying with relatives.
But Jackson knew the police were chasing him down and decided the game was up.
Finally, on the 14th of October, He came in and handed himself in company of his father.
The interview process began.
Roy, what is your full name, please?
Royston McDonald Jackson.
Right, you've been arrested for the murder of a man called Gordon Boone. We expect you to tell the truth. Are you going to tell us the truth today?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Brilliant. What have you got to tell us?
During his first interview, he was pretty confident. He said he ran because he thought that as he had a previous conviction for murder, he would be the #1 target.
I finished work, and when I got to the car park at Deerham, I seen people hovering around the car, like police officers, and I got a bit frightened being on life licence.
He denied everything. He gave an account of what he was doing, acknowledged that he knew him. He denied any involvement in the murder of Gordon Boone.
There was no evidence that you can come back and say, I'm responsible for this crime. I've got nothing to worry about in that regard.
He agreed that he had contacted Gordon Boone. He agreed that he did see Gordon Boone very fleetingly on the Friday night. However, he denied that Gordon Boone ever got into his motor vehicle and he was driven away.
Jackson was shown the CCTV footage, which seemed to show Gordon Boone in his vehicle.
When he was shown the footage, he gave no real reaction to that at all. He simply admitted that he'd gone to Gordon Boone's address. He claimed it was to return a DVD that had been borrowed, and that he sat outside his vehicle. Gordon Boone came down from his flat to his vehicle. There was an exchange of the DVD, and then he drove off.
Jackson always denied that anyone else was with him. Ultimately, he said he went to bed early, stayed in bed all night until the following day.
The garage CCTV told a different story. As well as being interviewed, Jackson also had his DNA taken, a mandatory procedure for anyone arrested in England and Wales since April 2004.
Advances in forensic science have dramatically changed modern policing to the extent that it's now one of the most powerful tools that police officers have when they're investigating crimes. The DNA database was set up in 1995, and that's been absolutely brilliant in providing instant answers to check whether people really are who they say they are, and also to see whether there's any link between them and a mark at a crime scene or on a victim.
There was an immediate hit on the DNA database, but what it revealed was totally unexpected.
That same profile came back as responsible for a rape of a female in the late 1980s in Essex. The suspect for that was in fact a taxi driver.
In 1989, Royston Jackson had a job driving taxis. The teenage girl Jackson targeted was a different profile to his other victims, but the method of attack was frighteningly familiar.
He had taken a female into a cul-de-sac and raped her in the back of the car, but also strangled her. She said in her statement she thought she was going to die. She didn't die, she did survive, and it was clearly Jackson who was responsible for this rape.
It is unusual for one person to target such a diverse range of victims, but they will have something in common. What I suspect that it is that they had a physical vulnerability. They were able to be overpowered by Jackson. Also, Jackson's got to have access and opportunity to get to a victim, and access and opportunity can be far more important than any other characteristic of a victim.
In interview, Jackson was very open about his sexuality.
I'm going to ask you a blunt question. How would you describe your sexuality?
Bisexual.
You're bisexual?
Yeah.
And it was now apparent that he wasn't selective when it came to choosing a victim.
Age and sex was irrelevant. He was a violent man and was capable of inflicting these offences on males and females.
The girl Jackson attacked had by this time moved on with her life and didn't wish to testify. So Jackson was never charged with the rape. but it might not have been an isolated attack.
Sex offending is highly, highly addictive. In fact, for every one rape conviction, the perpetrator has usually committed another 9 offences. It may be the case with Jackson that there are other rape victims out there.
It was now even more critical to take Royston Jackson off the streets for good.
This man was so dangerous, every effort needed to be made to ensure that he was convicted.
The questioning became more intense.
In the second interview, he made no comment whatsoever. When faced with evidence that was overwhelming, he chose not to say anything.
Despite the amount of evidence building up against Jackson, there still wasn't anything that definitively linked him with the murder.
My real concern was that after 3 days of initial questioning, there was insufficient evidence to charge Jackson.
It looked like Jackson would walk free, a terrifying prospect for the investigating officers.
In my view, he was going to offend again, and nobody could predict who the next victim would be.
However, there was a lucky break. In fleeing to Essex, Jackson had broken one of the terms of his licence, and so he was rearrested by the probation services.
He was actually taken back to prison, which gave us the opportunity to carry on with our investigation.
The police now had valuable time to pursue the case, and forensic science was about to make a vital breakthrough.
Royston Jackson's Ford Galaxy motor vehicle was extensively examined by a forensic team. It was basically taken apart, the whole interior was taken apart.
Once again, Jackson seemed to have been expecting this to happen.
In the first murder, he had cleaned the car. Indeed, in this murder, he'd cleaned his car, and he cleaned it pretty well.
This time, however, he hadn't been thorough enough.
Cars, like any other locations, can yield a surprising amount of forensic evidence. There were very small amounts of blood found in the car, which DNA profiling tests showed could have come from Mr. Boone. So that provided a good link between him and the car.
Jackson struggled to explain the blood.
He came up with the fact that Gordon Boone suffered continually with nosebleeds. Well, that was found to be something that was never ever substantiated.
And there was another crucial forensic discovery.
There were textile fibres found on Mr. Boone's boxer shorts, which matched some fibres found in Mr. Jackson's car. That would have provided evidence to suggest that he'd been in there and probably in a state of undress.
Royston Jackson couldn't give any explanation as to why fibres on his underwear would be inside his Ford Galaxy.
With the forensic team starting to find devastating evidence, there was another breakthrough in a local park.
Some members of staff, whilst clearing the bins, had found the smashed remains of a mobile phone and also some credit cards and bank and loyalty cards in the name of Gordon Boone.
This was a significant find, particularly because of the location.
They were about no more than 500 yards from Royston Jackson's home address.
The case against Jackson was mounting, and then the forensic team made another amazing discovery. It would be the decisive piece of evidence police were looking for.
However well prepared an offender is and however well they think they've cleaned up after themselves, it's usually possible for us to find tiny traces of evidence to link them with their crime.
Evidence linking Royston Jackson to the murder of Gordon Boone was growing, and forensic science was about to make another vital breakthrough.
Also on the body was a piece of green plastic, and the search of a brick shed next to Jackson's home address, on a broom there was an identical piece of green plastic which matched that on the body. We never actually completely bottomed out where Gordon Boone's body had been stored, indeed exactly where the murder had taken place. But Because this piece of plastic was on a broom and the same type of plastic was on the body, it's very likely that the body had been stored in the shed next to Jackson's house.
Potentially, Gordon Boone's body may well have been in that shed at Norwich Road for a period of time before it came to be deposited in the location where we actually found it.
The forensic team had done their job.
This was the final piece in the jigsaw.
Forensic evidence comes in many different forms. You can have DNA profiling, fingerprints, footwear marks, ballistics, textile fibres, a whole range of different things. Wherever there's a crime, there's a very good chance that the offender will have left some evidence behind and that we will be able to find it.
And finding that evidence meant the police now had enough to charge Jackson with murder.
Royston Jackson finally stood trial for the murder of Gordon Boone at Norwich Crown Court.
There was a dramatic start to the trial.
Straight away, Royston Jackson decided that he was going to break with his legal team. I think exactly what had happened was that his legal team walked away from Royston Jackson. The term used was due to professional embarrassment. Exactly why his team had left him, we never knew. But within a few days, a new defence team was put in place, and the trial then went ahead and lasted for 3 to 4 weeks.
During the trial, Jackson was impassive. When the evidence was being heard, there was no emotion from him, even when the evidence becomes overwhelming.
I went to the trial every day. I think he was confident that he was going to get off.
It's not surprising to me that Jackson didn't show any emotion during his trial. Let's face it, this is not somebody who has any capacity for empathy. He's able to put his hands round the throat of a victim and look them in the face while he squeezes. Even hardened soldiers who are trained to kill would have difficulties with that kind of up-close and personal assault.
Jackson's apparent indifference didn't help.
Royston Jackson was found guilty of Gordon Boone's murder, and the fact that he'd served already 1 life sentence for a murder, the judge gave him a full life tariff, and he would remain the rest of his living years behind bars.
Jackson is in that very rare group of offenders who have killed, been caught, and yet left prison and killed again. Given the range of his victims, we really wouldn't know where he could strike next.
In cases like this, judges can insist killers are never released.
The whole life tariff is rarely given out in this country, which proves how dangerous a man Jackson is.
But Jackson seemed completely unfazed by the sentence he received.
When the sentence was given out, he sat impassively in the dock. There was no real reaction from him whatsoever.
Even when he's convicted, emotion, none.
The man who killed Gordon Boone wasn't a vigilante or one of his victims, but a friend. Jackson has never offered any explanation for his actions, and the motive for the murder remains a mystery.
Jackson was a thoroughly unpleasant, violent, unpredictable individual. He was a bully. Lots of witnesses in all the cases that he'd been involved in were frightened of him.
I'm glad he's put away for life, because I wouldn't want him to inflict any harmful things on anybody else.
The public are a lot safer with Royston Jackson behind bars.
If he comes out, he will kill again.
For Katie Utting, the trial wasn't the final chapter in the story, because the father who had abused her for so many years still had to be laid to rest.
When we finally buried him, that's when I knew he was gone and nobody else can get hurt. Well, I'd been ill from the time that I was told my dad had died. I started getting better as soon as that curtain started closing and the casket going through. And I thought, well, now this is over. The day of the funeral, I started to live again.